eh 40. Ngayon, patas ng naging 50, naging 60, hanggang 81, 81, hanggang umabot ng 90.
The people in the middle are definitely falling through the cracks, for sure, 100%.
Madalas po kulang kami sa pagkain. Alam po ni Lord yan.
We see a deepening strategic partnership between Moscow and Beijing.
北约才是世界和平稳定的系统性挑战。
These are structural insecurities that we now face globally: geopolitical, economic, existential, climate, and pandemics together. Each threat feeds into the other and compounds the difficulties that we face.
人类正在面临着二战以来最大的一场危机。
I have 3 children, 1 grandchild. We work very, very hard to have what we have. Working 2 jobs each. I work 56 hours a week, 40 at my full-time job, and then 16 at my part-time job.
That doesn't leave a lot of time for like life. Are you tired?
All the time.
Christine and her husband each took on their second jobs recently because of inflation. With soaring grocery and gas bills, the family has had to cut back on many things.
I feel like I make decent money, and I'm like, why are we still struggling?
The price of gas has really affected my husband more because he has quite a long commute to work. He has to fill up at least twice a week. 4 days, he spent over $200, which is absurd. What's the point of working if most of your paycheck goes to gas? There you go. I would have anxiety when I'm pumping gas for fear of how much it's gonna cost. That's why I try to do it at around a half. Should go get the children milk, which I think it's like $5 a gallon. We go through a gallon easily every day. I think it used to be like just under 4. It's crazy. I told them they gotta cut back. I mean, I hate to say we also cut back on like buying the healthier stuff because it's more expensive. Last summer, we used to get ice cream a lot out. I can't tell you the last time we've done that. So if you're walking by, you can stop and take what you need.
Christine has been volunteering at this food bank run by Chelsea Speed. The place serves about 600 families.
Over the past 4 to 8 weeks, we've seen a really big increase in families. I think what's causing us to grow so rapidly would be the inflation with the gas prices, the increase in cost of food and living, utility costs going up. So recently, I've seen a big uptick in middle-class families coming to receive food. We have people that contact us anonymously that want us to drop it off on a porch or meet them somewhere because they're so embarrassed, to reach out and ask for help.
Chelsea reached out to me to see if I could help her unload one of the trucks that were coming down. And at that point, I was like, I don't know how we're buying groceries this pay, but okay. And then miraculously, Chelsea texts me. She's like, hey, I'm getting a truck. Do you think you can come down and help me unload? And I'm like, yeah, I can totally do that. And she's like, I know that things have been tough for you guys, so take what you need. Don't be afraid. And I'm like, yeah, I think I will this time.
The people in the middle are definitely falling through the cracks, for sure, 100%. So we are stationed in a, I would have to say, pretty middle upper class location for our food pantry, and we're quite busy. I'm not in that bucket of people who don't want to work. I'm in the bucket of, I'm working a lot. I'm working my butt off. And the American politicians just don't get it. They're never gonna get it because they're not living our lives. They're not struggling.
It's sad that you have to have two incomes and barely make ends meet.
Midterm elections in the US are coming up in November.
We're going to elect an incredible slate of America First Republicans up and down the ballot.
And inflation is the top complaint against President Biden's administration.
So in order, for example, to mitigate damage, political damage, because of rising prices, the Biden administration is releasing, 1.5 million barrels a day of strategic reserve oil. And that's done, with the thought of the midterm elections rapidly approaching, no question about that.
Galloping inflation is a global phenomenon. The cracks are starting to show in many countries, where large crowds have gathered to protest inflation. Many governments, already stretched from pandemic spending, have few fiscal powers left to subsidize away the pains of inflation.
En el barrio hay mucha gente, muchos nenitos que van al comedor a retirar la mercadería y hay que darle el alimento, la olla, la comida, ¿o no, compañera? Sí. Hay mucha hambre, mucha pobreza en los barrios. Que vaya también el gobierno ahí a los barrios y entre.
As prices spiraled, Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan was ousted in April 2022. Continued inflation brought many of his supporters to the streets. Pakistan's inflation was 27% in August. In Sri Lanka, dramatic scenes of protesters storming the presidential palace. The economic problems there are many. Inflation hit a record 64% in August, a 21-year high. Richer countries are also not spared. In the UK, inflation hits a peak of over 10%, the highest in 40 years. In Greece, the elderly take to the streets. Their pensions can't cover expenses.
Έχουμε να αντιμετωπίσουμε σοβαρά προβλήματα σαν κοινωνία και συνταξιούχοι. Είναι τα ζητήματα της ακρίβειας, τα αντιμετωπίζουμε καθημερινά στη ζωή μας, στο σούπερ μάρκετ που πάμε να ψωνίσουμε, στη βενζίνη, παίρνουμε τη σύνταξή μας και μετά από 5 το πολύ 10 μέρες η σύνταξη αυτή έχει εξαφανιστεί. Δεν πάει άλλο.
In Ghana, in Africa, inflation is leading to political instability, with protesters calling for the impeachment of the president. It's the same in Bangladesh, as people take to the streets to protest fuel price increases. In country after country, the global economic storm has exacerbated underlying troubles.
In the next several years, the fact that interest rates will be much higher is going to make life very difficult for countries with high debts. And a large part of the developing world, the low-income countries and lower middle-income countries, are already in debt distress. They already were before this bout of inflation, and now the situation is going to be much worse. Most of the advanced world, populations that are much older compared to the 1970s when you had that last major inflation shock, 70s and early 80s, they're much more sensitive to price increases, cost of living increases. And older people in particular are very often on fixed incomes, and the value of that income they get, the value of their savings, goes down because of inflation. And it's very hard to have people focus on the longer-term challenges, climate change in particular, if they're having to deal with this current problem. They don't have the bandwidth for it. The politics of the moment, too, tends to then focus on today's problems and leave aside tomorrow's problems.
Lalabas ako ng alas 5, aabutin ako ng alas 12 ng gabi. Hindi pa sapat na lumalabas pa sila lahat, hindi pa. Kasi nga yung iba walang trabaho.
Magkano na ngayon, kuya?
81.15. 40. Ngayon, patas ng naging 50, naging 55, naging 60, 62. Ngayon, itong na to, patas ng patas, 75, hanggang 81, hanggang umabot ng 90. Magkano presyo ng 1 kilong baboy?
350 po.
50. Dati nung araw, 190. Mura lang kasi ng Ngayon, 350, hindi ko na kaya. Nabilihin.
Ano na lang binili mo?
Ito, puro gulay, tsaka...
Si Papa.
Oh, kumusta kayo? Kumain na ba kayo? Di pa?
Pagkain mahirap, lalo na ngayon. Mahal yung bilihin. Tapos ang taas ng krudo. Nung bago mag-pandemic nakakapag-uwi pa yan siya minsan ng buong manok. Magkano yun? 200 plus. Tapos may kita pa. Tapos may soft drinks pa. Ngayon kahit juice kami, hindi kami makabili. Dalawa na po ngayon.
Dati naghahanda kayo.
Nung nag-1 siya, nakapag-utang ako. Pinanghanda lang namin sa kanya. Kabili kami ng hotdog na maliliit, 2 balot, tapos nag-spaghetti ako ng 1 kilo.
Ngayon?
Wala. Hindi kasama, wala na sa plano. Hindi na kaya eh. Minsan, pag nakakaluwag lang, hinahati ko po yun sa baso. Tapos, dinagdadagan ko siya ng tubig. Ganun lang ginagawa ko kasi 2. Yung isa minsan nangihingi, naawa naman ako. Tapos, lagyan ko lang sukal. Madalas.
Madalas po kulang kami sa pagkain. Alam po ni Lord yan.
Ano pa sakit kasi ngayon?
Sakit po. Tulad kagabi, hindi ko alam kumain yung anak ko. Wala kasi kami ulam. Kumain siya, tulog na kami. Tapos kanina ko nalaman tagising ko. Buti may mantika kami. Yung babae ko, inulam niya, mantika. Tapos nilagyan niya siguro ng asin.
The family's biggest fear is the possibility of a typhoon destroying their home. Every year, at least 8 typhoons smash into the Philippines. And extreme weather events are expected to worsen globally due to climate change. The Philippines is at the forefront of the crisis, with cities made especially vulnerable due to poor urban planning and inadequate drainage systems.
May tulo pa rin dito, banda rito eh. Kaya yung tulo ng yung ulan, ba rito. Kami po natutulog dito. Kinakabahan kami pagka lalong may ulan saka hangin. Sabay yun. Minsan, nakaupo lang kami dyan pagka umaangga yung ulan. Pumapasok dito.
Naano lang baka lumipad po yung ano lang kasi sa yung parang lona. Tapos sako, lona, may nakapatong. Tapos yung mga bubong po niyan medyo sira na. Noong nakaraan, nilipad kaya lahat ng ulan na punta sa amin. Yung mga yero po na na pag mahangin ng malakas, sa mga bata po delikado kasi nagliliparan yung mga yero, hindi naman ganun katibay yung mga bubong dito sa amin. Mga sira-sirang yero lang din naman. Tapos yung minsan, pag malakas po yung ulan, mabaha po dito sa amin. Malang krudo, hindi tuloy-tuloy yung biyahe, tapos sa pagkain, mahal ang bilhin, lahat mahal. Hindi maiwasan na iinit yung ulo mo na walang dahilan. Pag naiisip mo, ba't ganito kahirap?
Ang kinita ko ngayon, 400 hanggang alas 5 hanggang alas 12 ng gabi.
Saya bergelut di dunia warteg kurang lebih sudah 7 tahun. Untuk saat ini adalah masa-masa tersulit di luar dari pandemi. Mengingat pandemi baru berlalu kurang lebih 3 bulan yang lalu, para pengusaha kuliner ini baru bernafas lega. Kita bebas terima pelanggan untuk makan di tempat, baru nyaman jualan, ternyata diterpa dan dihantam dengan kenaikan harga yang secara menyeluruh.
Jamur perapat aja.
Larang kape, Bu.
Larang kape, belanjanya nangis, aku yang nangis ini udah kurang matang rumahnya. Iya, lah. Ada kantongnya di?
Kantongnya.
Kalau untuk saat ini kenaikan harga pangan, khususnya yang bersangkutan dengan bahan baku untuk warteg itu kenaikannya luar biasa, Pak. Dimulai dari awal kita ada kenaikan minyak yang harganya melambung tinggi bisa 2-3 kali lipat dari harga awal. Sekarang disusul untuk bahan baku sayur mayur, telur, dan lain sebagainya.
Soaring global cooking oil prices led Indonesia to impose an export ban on palm oil in late April 2022. Since then, high production volumes managed to bring prices down. But that slide has not applied to most of the other food ingredients in the country.
Untuk kenaikan yang signifikan selain minyak adalah cabai merah. Untuk saat ini kenaikan hingga 4 kali lipat dari harga normal. Yang kedua ada bawang merah, kenaikan bisa sampai 3 kali lipat dari harga normal. Dan disusul lagi dengan sayur mayur yang lain rata-rata kenaikan 3-4 kali lipat. Semua bahan-bahan yang tadi saya sebutkan itu adalah bahan-bahan pokok, bahan-bahan utama yang kami gunakan dalam usaha kuliner kami. Karena nggak semua warteg itu bisa menarik omset besar gitu, Pak. Oke, mungkin kalau warteg saya bisa bertahan. Banyak warteg-warteg konvensional, warteg kecil itu yang nggak bisa bertahan gitu, karena dia nggak bisa bersaing juga. Untuk masalah harga, untuk pembelanjaan mereka juga nggak bisa atur, itu luar biasa dampaknya. Alhamdulillah kami tergabung dalam satu wadah franchise warteg. Alhamdulillah kita bisa survive, saling mendukung, saling bahu-membahu, saling beri info, untuk mendapatkan harga termurah dengan barang terbaik.
Nonetheless, profit for this stall has dropped 50%. On top of that, as inflation bites, fewer people choose to eat out.
Kami tetap berjuang, Mas. Apapun keadaannya, kami akan tetap berusaha karena kami nggak akan rela usaha kami gulung tikar hanya karena kenaikan harga. Kami tetap bertahan karena kami masih punya karyawan, saya juga masih menghidupi keluarga saya.
ที่โรงเรียนเนี่ยผมว่าอินเฟลชันเนี่ยมีผลกระทบต่อครอบครัวต่อผู้ปกครองมากกว่าโควิดอีก
About 200,000 students in Thailand had dropped out of school in 2021, mainly due to the pandemic. This year, the Education Ministry is working hard to bring these students back into the school system. But inflation has made it difficult for some of the older kids.
The impact of inflation on the dropout at the upper secondary level, I think, would be quite significant because of economic demand, maybe not from the parents' will, but more on the students perceive their role as having to help their families to earn and make a living. So I think the students themselves would feel the force of having to work rather than study.
แล้วถ้าเกิดว่าโควิดกำลังจะผ่านไปแล้วก็ไม่รู้ว่าจะมีอะไรอีกนะครับแล้วก็ภาวะอินเฟลชันproblem อะไรพวกนี้จะมาเราไม่สามารถคาดการณ์อนาคตได้ว่าเราจะทำยังไงแต่เราก็มีสิ่งหนึ่งที่เราจะทำก็คือเราจะต้องแก้ปัญหาในเชิงการบริหารในโรงเรียนนะครับว่าเด็กมีปัญหาอย่างนู้นอย่างนี้ถ้าผมคาดการณ์ว่าเนี่ยมันจะมีปัญหาอะไรไหมเนี่ยผมว่ามีครับมีนะครับยกตัวอย่างภาวะซึมเศร้าdepressed พวกนี้นะฮะของเด็กนะครับของผู้ปกครองนะครับซึ่งอาจจะมีผลต่อโรงเรียนต่อครูต่อผู้บริหารอะไรครับที่เราจะต้องหาทางแก้ปัญหาและก็ช่วยเหลือ
In April 2022, UNICEF reported that globally, some 24 million children and youth were at risk of dropping out altogether.
It's a very serious problem. COVID made it worse because on average, a year and a half of education was lost in the developing world. And in many parts of the world, girls especially didn't return to education. Many were forced into early marriage, in fact, with all the problems that come with that. So you really have a scarring of a whole generation because they're set back not just by that 1.5 years of lost education. If you lose 1.5 years of lost education, you also forget what you learned earlier on. So it's more than 1.5 years. It's really the setting back of a whole generation. And there'll be consequences for that, consequences for economies, but more importantly for the nature of those societies, for the sense of optimism. So we have to now address it urgently.
Sana makapag-aral sila. Paano makapag-aral sa hirap? Hindi ko matutos-tosan.
The family's eldest daughter, Gia, aspires to work in the airline industry.
Masipag siya mag-aral kasi simula nung nag-pandemic module na. Minsan hindi ko naasikaso yan.
But if the basics continue to be unaffordable, Gia would likely have to drop out.
Hindi ko lang masabi po sa kanya kasi baka mamaya umiyak sila. Kaya hindi ko sinasabi sa kanila.
Pero sa loob mo?
Gusto kong pag-aralin.
Ba't ko umiiyak? Nahihirapan ka ba, Gia, sa sitwasyon nyo? Question, anong gusto mo magbago sa sitwasyon nyo?
Yung makaalis kami sa mahirap na buhay.
Kano ba sa tingin mo makakaalis sa mahirap na buhay, Gia?
Pag nakapagtrabaho na ako, kasi nakapagtapos ako ng pag-aaral.
Inflation, hunger, rocketing energy prices, political unrest. These are all indirect consequences of the Russia and Ukraine war. And if that has caused such chaos in the global production system, imagine a war between the world's #1 and #2 superpowers.
The discussion as to whether or not Taiwan is at risk of some kind of forced unification event is absolutely being discussed in boardrooms around the world.
Tensions in East Asia have never been higher in the last 4 decades.
Tensions are boiling over in the Taiwan Strait after Beijing authorities announced targeted military drills in several areas around the island.
We see a deepening strategic partnership between Moscow and Beijing. And China's growing assertiveness and its coercive policies have consequences for the security of allies and our partners. China is substantially building up its military forces, including nuclear weapons, bullying its neighbors and threatening Taiwan.
北约才是世界和平稳定的系统性挑战。北约宣称自己是区域性、防御性组织，实际上却不断地突破地域和领域，到处发动战争，杀害无辜平民。
I'm sure neither China nor the US, and certainly not Taiwan, will want to see a worsening of tensions that could lead to a conflict. What's critical is that the strategic caution, which in fact does exist on the side of both the US and China, is matched by tactical caution and tactical discipline. Because otherwise, after some point, it's tactics that shape perception of what your strategy is. In other words, what you actually do is read as your strategy. I think more fundamentally, we are not at an equilibrium in US-China relations. The situation is deteriorating. And it's critical both for those two superpowers as well as for the world that a new understanding is formed. And it has to be a strategic understanding formed fundamentally on the basis of the common interests they share. The common interest in tackling climate change, preparing for pandemics, and ensuring that there's global financial stability, and in peace and security as well. Those are common interests that the US, China, the European Union, and the whole world shares. But the US-China relationship is critical to addressing those challenges of the global commons. It is absolutely critical. We will not be able to address it otherwise. And that has to shape a basic strategic relationship. They will compete, and fortunately they're competing in a common global market, which is a huge achievement. They will have to compete, there'll have to be fair competition, there'll have to be updating of the rules to ensure fair competition, but that competition cannot define their whole relationship. It cannot make one the adversary of the other.
The US had said it would use sanctions if China invaded Taiwan.
After 30 plus years of forming supply chains, of sort of intertwining supply chains and running value chains in and out of China as a major hub, now we are seeing global value chains splitting into 3 different levels. The first level involves strategic goods, strategic technologies, things like pharmaceuticals, rare earths, semiconductors, medical equipment, lithium batteries, that sort of thing. These are highly strategic. To have a reliance on one country, in this case China, that is just not a geopolitically viable position to take. So we are seeing strategic decoupling in that top band. Below that is a much broader gray area, and they involve all kinds of dual-use technologies. So depending on how the relationship between China and the United States, China and Europe, and other G7 Western countries, products and supply chains in that gray area could suddenly overnight become subject to sanctions and export controls. Now, an invasion of Taiwan or some kind of offensive action against Taiwan would put that entire band, that gray area, that middle area at risk, which means that a huge segment of trade and investment and exchange between China and the United States and Europe could potentially overnight be wiped off the board.
In January 2022, President Biden announced plans by Intel Corp to expand operations in the U.S.
This historic investment for Ohio, one of the largest investments in semiconductor manufacturing in American history. A brand new $20 billion campus outside of Columbus, Ohio. We're going to stamp everything we can made in America, especially these computer chips.
Semiconductor manufacturing has been a national security issue. That's because many American companies depend on chips produced overseas, particularly in Taiwan.
My administration is going to keep using all the tools we have to reshore our supply chains, strengthen our economic resilience, and make more in America.
The competition bill provides over $250 billion in funding to bring key industries back to the U.S. and bolster U.S. competitiveness with China. In an era of geopolitical risk, globalization has given way to slowbalization, offshoring to friendshoring, just in time to just in case.
Given this perfect storm of geopolitics, climate change, and of course the lingering effects of the pandemic, we can expect a new paradigm when it comes to global trade, and that is that the West in particular, the G7 countries, have now turned away from decades of economic dogma regarding laissez-faire economics, right, and the supremacy of free and open trade, and they have moved to a managed trade position, meaning that governments are far more active, they're far more interventionist, and they are rolling out a whole new collection, if you will, of non-tariff measures, particularly export controls.
But it takes time for businesses to react to geopolitics. And the data demonstrates that decoupling between China and the US is slow. Take agriculture, for example. In May 2022, the US Department of Agriculture reported that farm exports to China alone were forecast to come in at a record $36 billion this fiscal year, more than double the $17 billion of the 2020 fiscal year. China is the largest market for US food exporters. Today, General Motors sells more cars in China than in the US. Of Tesla's almost 1 million vehicles delivered worldwide last year, half of them came from its factory in Shanghai. Tesla has said it will be investing more in China to expand production capacity. From agricultural goods to an array of raw materials and components for manufacturing, the economic relationship between the two superpowers remains profound and is actually growing deeper in several sectors. According to a new survey by the American Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai, of more than 300 American companies in China, 60% reported increased investment compared with 2020. But that is not to say that war isn't on people's minds.
We have companies that are actually investing more now in China to essentially insulate and protect their in China for China operations, even as they're looking to ring fence supply chains outside of China in distinct local markets. That's a paradox that didn't exist 10 or 15 years ago. But that is a paradox that companies now have to live with. And that is that we're in a state of flux. There's a far more uncertainty when it comes to the global trade environment. And there's far more risk that could emerge in the form of supply chain disruption.
In China, policymakers are also thinking through the different aspects of their trade with the West.
实际上，中国的粮食安全啊，一直都是中国政府最重视的议题。中国一直讲求18亿亩耕地的红线不能破，这是中国的这个粮食安全的红线。也一直讲求这个3大口粮必须要自主自给。我们对美国年均的农产品的进口，主要在肉类和大豆啊，我们吃饱中国人自己完全能解决啊。那么吃得好，比如说你看中国现在小孩子特别喜欢吃汉堡包。 那汉堡包是由这个里面油啊、面啊，它有很多大豆啊，它需要这些原料。我们现在的这个吃得越来越好，吃得越来越金贵。那这要吃得好，恐怕要靠全球的这个进口粮食的进口啊，这是没法满足。
In Uzbekistan, vast farmlands owned by a Chinese company are an example of how China has been trying to diversify its food supplies.
这里主要是种西红柿，那么在别的大棚里还有种黄瓜。这个就是中国最先进的一个现代化的设施大棚，那么4季都可以种植，因为知道乌兹夏天是非常的热的，外边的温度可以达到50多度。那么当这个季节不可以种植的时候，我们这个大棚里也是可以种植的，因为它有现代化的控制温度、湿透的这个系统和设施。我们有这个专业的这个水帘和这个风机，它们组合起来，外边的温度50度的时候，它可以把这个大棚的温度降到28度以下。冬天的时候呢，也有这种加热的暖气，然后也可以种植。那么它这个温度和湿度的控制都是用这种电脑上可以查。 也就是说，老板在国内，都可以看到这里有多少度、湿度，然后是怎么样的一个情况。在上海，摄像头一看，的工人都在干什么？你们有没有摘？有没有做什么？什么都可以知道。
我觉得中国加强粮食安全大概3点。第一呢，就是绝对的这个守住18亿亩耕地的红线，绝对的保证98%以上的主粮控制在中国粮农 和中国土地的这个范围和手里这是第一点。第二点呢，在进口农产品的问题上，保证进口的多元化。第三呢，就是中国在海外屯田的进程不断的加快，使得中国的这个粮食的种植变得更加的全球化。
Over the past few years, Chinese buyers have invested in farmlands in countries as diverse as France, Kenya, and Indonesia. Hunger, disease, flood, drought, war, and inflation. A perfect storm. But there is one silver lining amidst the intense geopolitical competition between China and the US.
Our nations and our world stand at a genuine inflection point in history. Managing global energy needs, taking on the climate crisis, dealing with the spread of diseases. And the choices we make now, in my view, are going to set a direction of our world for several generations to come. Today, we officially launched the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment. We aim to mobilize nearly $600 billion from the G7 by 2027. These strategic investments are areas of critical to sustainable development and to our shared global stability. Health and health security, digital connectivity, gender equality and equity, climate and energy security.
Inside one of Southeast Asia's less developed countries, groundwork is being laid for a water, sanitation and drainage project which will bring clean water to about 500,000 people in Dili. This $420 million project is funded by the U.S. Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment. It's the largest investment the U.S. has made in Southeast Asia in the past year under the scheme.
For the water project, we'll introduce critical infrastructure. For example, we'll provide for the first centralized wastewater treatment facility. It will improve drainage, and will provide safe, clean drinking water to the residents in Dili and surrounding communities. The U.S. and Timor-Leste share a joint commitment to reducing poverty and building a sustainable, inclusive economic growth. And this nearly $500 million investment is seeking to deliver on that commitment.
China has also been an active investor in East Timor, helping to build a highway and constructing the newly opened Tibau Bay Port, which is the first modern deep-water container port in the country.
You have, through the Belt and Road initiatives, the Chinese are building wind farms and solar farms. And so the G7 are now, at least they're saying that they're going to step up and they're going to counter this by matching it and by, coming in and building their own, partnerships and infrastructure. So that's an example of, a geopolitical competition actually playing well for emerging markets.
Amidst competition with the West, China is also doubling down on projects to win hearts and minds. This year, the buzzword has been the Global Development Initiative. Speaking at a virtual forum to global leaders, President Xi pledged $4 billion to the initiative.
合作才能办成大事，办成好事，办成长久之事。发达国家要履行义务，发展中国家要深化合作，南北双方要相向而行，共建团结、平等、均衡、普惠的全球发展伙伴关系，不让任何一个国家、任何一个人掉队。
A hospital in Laos demonstrates the Global Development Initiative at work.
ห้องหมอหมู่สนของพวกเราสร้างมาได้สร้างที่ปี1903มาฮอดปีนี้ก็ถือว่า119 ปียิงใส่ห้องหมอของพวกเราคือว่ามาเมื่อกี้นี้มันเป็นห้องหมอที่เก่าจังซั่นนี่ก็มีหลายตึกกระแจกกระจายจังซั่นทางฝ่ายจีนเพิ่นก็เลยว่าเป็นการช่วยเหลือลาในการก่อสร้างห้องหมอหลังใหม่ถือว่าบรรดาตึกเก่าถือว่าถูกทุบม้างออกและสร้างตึกใหม่ทดแทน
150 beds were added to the hospital with the new building, with more expected when the second building is complete. President Xi himself attended the groundbreaking ceremony for the construction of the hospital.
และก็ยินดีที่ว่าพวกเราได้รับห้องหมอใหม่สำหรับตึกนี้เราได้เปิดตั้งแต่เดือน2022มาฮอดปัจจุบันเห็นว่าแต่ละเดือนคนเจ็บมารับใช้บริการขึ้นเรื่อยๆไปการมีเครื่องไม้เครื่องมือที่ทันสมัยขึ้นก็ช่วยได้หลายอย่างเนาะถือว่าการรับใช้คนเจ็บมันได้ไวว่องไวสะดวกไวขึ้นกว่าเก่าเนาะ
全球发展倡议跟“一带一路”来讲呢，它实际上是一个相辅相成的关系。“一带一路”呢，更多的提倡于对这个双边甚至多边层面上的推进这个互联互通的这样的一个合作。那么全球发展倡议呢，它从更高的顶层设计层面去看待全球层面的未来的发展问题。那么现在我们很明显的可以看到，联合国的这个2030 SDG 的这个目标 目前看来已经很难实现。那么这就更加体现了全球发展倡议的重要性。
We need more investment in the developing world. And it's a positive development that both China and the US and the European Union are putting more resources into this now. It ideally should not be bilateral because we already suffer from too much bilateralization of what should be multilateral action. China has to be given its appropriate part in the multilateral institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, all the regional development institutions. And even bilateral initiatives have to be joined up together. They have to work in concert. Countries will want to take credit for what they're doing. The major donor countries will want to take some credit. And there's ways in which they can take credit. But we've got to join up action, and there has to be proper multilateral coordination. Otherwise, we get more of the same happening decade after decade of inconsistent effort, of efforts that are at odds with each other sometimes, and a lack of transparency.